What's up, Bellingham? This is Family Recipe Radio. Well, I kind of had to scramble to get in here, running a little behind, but yeah, hello and welcome. So today's episode, today's topic, I'm going to go over a place called the Western State Mental Hospital. It's in Lakewood, Washington. It has a fairly interesting history, kind of nightmarish and ghoulish, as those old institutions tended to be. So we're going to get into that. But first of all, we're going to hang out for a second, listen to some tunes. This is Family Recipe Radio here on 94.9 KZAX LPFM Bellingham. I'm going to start off with Salty Dog by Mississippi John Hurt. So I wanted to get into the Western State Hospital, which is kind of our region's, ghost from the past, one of those old-style mental institutions that opened in the late 1800s. So lots of unpleasant things happened there back in the day. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about something that I found kind of interesting. It was a study, or an experiment more like, conducted by this guy, David Rosenhan, in 1972. He basically was trying to test the validity of psychiatric diagnosis, and I think he just wanted to see like the inner workings of the hospital. He was pretty instrumental in the deinstitutionalization phase, where a lot more light was being shed on like the horrible treatments that people were undergoing. And it's kind of all because of this guy's experiment. So this guy, David Rosenhan, he basically in 1972, he released a paper called On Being Sane in Insane Places. And he outlined his experiment, right, that he undertook with 8 other people. So basically it was like a group of just various people. There was one in his 20s, a grad student studying psychology. There were some older ones too. There were 3 practicing psychologists, a pediatrician, and a psychiatrist. And one was a painter and one was a housewife. So basically the experiment began with them contacting different institutions around the country. Each person was going to have a separate institution that they were going to try to infiltrate to study, right? So they basically, his story goes in his paper, they contacted these hospitals and they were basically like, I'm having hallucinations. I'm having audio hallucinations. I'm having this voice in my head. I can hear it talking to me. And that was the only thing besides their assumed names that they lied about. Everything else, their history, their personal, like their real psychological issues and their history, their relationship with their parents and all that, that was all real. They didn't alter anything except for, they said, I'm having hallucinations. They were told to say, yeah, the voices, they're hollow sounding, they're kind of muffled, they're very subtle, but they're still there. And amazingly, according to this guy, they just let these people in like pretty much immediately. So none of the staff of these places knew anyone was coming in. He had coordinated with the wardens a release date for all these people, but he didn't tell these people in the experiment that they were going to be released at a certain time. They were under the impression that they had to prove themselves to be sane to get out, which I know people didn't really know what was going on in mental hospitals at the time, but like, oh Lord, if someone told me to do that and was like, yeah, you have to get yourself out of this situation, I would be like, no way. That is so scary. Like, I'm going to be stuck in there forever. I already get weird looks as it is, but like, yeah. So anyway, these 8 brave souls, they entered the mental institutions. So they got into the hospitals and they were supposed to immediately drop the act, basically be like, oh, I'm actually fine. Like, I'm feeling fine. The voices are gone. So they just started living life as they basically normally would in these hospitals. Just passing the time basically by hanging out with the other inmates, trying to talk to the staff and whatnot. And they were kind of nervous at first, but the main thing they said they felt was just this like crushing boredom because there's like basically nothing to do. So their job now, like their whole life, was basically to just meticulously document everything that was going on with them and everything that was going on with the other patients. So basically, yeah, they would have checkups with the nurses, and every time they did, they would be like, I'm fine. I am feeling completely sane. Thank you very much. And the nurses, I guess, were just very like, okay, buddy, sort of like pat you on the head. So one second, my notes here. So basically, they realized that like faking or not faking, proving their sanity was extremely difficult, much more difficult than they originally believed. And after this initial nervousness kind of faded away, they had this like, it was a different anxiety. It was more like they started to kind of feel like they had to survive. They kind of went into like survival mode because they were like, I'm going to be stuck in here forever. Everyone's looking at me like I'm crazy. No one's listening to me. These nurses and stuff barely have any contact with me. Like they're barely out of the like employee quarters. So what they did is they tried to be as agreeable and cooperative as they possibly could and just do everything they asked. They tried to like be super friendly, chat up the nurses and stuff. No, nothing weird was happening with them yet. But despite all this, despite the cooperation, despite, just being like average people, they were never once suspected. Not any doubt was ever lauded at them. And basically, even though the staff were like, yeah, they seem normal, the records of them basically say, oh, they're schizophrenics in remission. So yeah, it was proving to be extremely difficult once you got stuck with a diagnosis like this to get rid of it, like nearly impossible. So their average sentence was 19 days. One or two people stayed for 52 days. Which you would think 19 days alone would be enough to diagnose these undercover patients, right? But nobody even came close. So the people who did immediately sniff them out, though, was the other patients there were immediately like, you're just like a normal dude. A lot of them were like, you're an undercover journalist. Like they pegged them immediately, which they reported to the staff, and obviously the staff ignored them because if you're already expecting someone to be, kind of nuts, and they come up to you and they're like, hey, that guy, he's not crazy. He's an undercover like cop. He's infiltrated the hospital and he's trying to like find the inner workings of this place. Like they're not going to believe you. They're just going to be like, oh, okay, here's your Thorazine, which is it's very sad. This whole like pigeonholing of people with mental illness is something that really, it's one of my personal gripes. And it's a shame. And I think people are often misunderstood in these circumstances. And this was like the first large scale instance of people recognizing it, or this being basically brought to national attention with his article and stuff. So anyway, yeah, the other patients were like, these guys are definitely journalists or something. Like they're acting kind of fishy by not acting fishy at all. They're acting fishy. They're sticking out to the patients. So incredibly, the admission staff that was basically going to be bringing people in to these hospitals, they were alerted that there was going to be undercover patients, but they weren't told who they were or exactly when they were coming in, right? So they basically, over this 3-month period, each one of these hospitals was like, yeah, there's going to be one person that is going to be sane and he's going to be faking his symptoms, right? So they all received this, the admission staffs, they all received this little page, right? So each time they admitted somebody to the hospital, there was like a grading system. It's basically 1 to 10, like 1 is the least likely chance of them being a plant or being a fake patient. And 10 is like, they are definitely faking it, but I still let them in anyway for whatever reason. So none of them were even on the list. None of them even, I think all of the actual like fake patients, they scored 1. There was many other people, however, that scored super high, like even a couple 10s in there, and they actually had like legitimate diagnosed mental illnesses, and they, to my knowledge, never got out of there. So yeah, the detection software on these hospitals is pretty, it leaves something to be desired. But yeah, I just thought that was pretty intense. Like nobody, not a single one was suspected one time. So they were quickly realizing it's nearly impossible to overcome this label of being schizophrenic. And, you know, as I said, if any of the researchers themselves were going to be like, hey, I'm just kidding, I'm actually a researcher, they were just going to get like a blank stare by the nurses and be like, go back to your room. So looking a little like closer at the notes and stuff that the nurses took, they basically framed a lot of the their existing sort of psychological issues in their outside life. They would kind of twist it in a way to make it sound like a lot worse than it actually was. There was this one 39-year-old guy who infiltrated the place. And basically, what he said upon coming in, they asked him about his family. And this is all he said. He was like, well, initially I had a good relationship with my father, but as I grew up, me and my mother became closer, and I don't talk to my dad too much. And that was basically it. It was like, no marriage issues, really. Like, they fought sometimes, but they weren't like, you know, it wasn't a toxic relationship, to use today's words. And that's pretty much all. He disciplined the kids a little bit, but like this was the 70s. I think like, you know, spanking and stuff was a lot more common. I'm not saying it's right, but as far as like the psychological industry goes, it shouldn't have been like considered super out of the ordinary because everyone was getting spanked. So this is what they wrote to that completely like vanilla, benign information that this guy that he mentioned about his family life. It said, quote, "This white 39-year-old male manifests a long history of considerable ambivalence in close relationships, which begins in early childhood. A warm relationship with his father cools during his adolescence. A distant relationship to his father is described as becoming very intense. Effective stability is absent. His attempts to control the emotionality of his wife and children are punctuated by angry outbursts and, in the case of the children, spankings. And while he says he has several good friends, one senses considerable ambivalence embedded in those close relationships also." So, I don't know, I've never met this guy. I'm just going by the word of this article on being sane in insane places. But, I mean, it seems like some serious what is that word? They're twisting the narrative is what I'm trying to say. Because, they were like, this guy's crazy. I need to look for anything that proves my theory, kind of. Like, not in a harmful way. They weren't trying to do any harm. I think they were genuinely trying to help. But anyway, so yes, personal histories were definitely overblown. So, like I said earlier, these patients, these pseudo-patients, the people who infiltrated the place, they were constantly taking notes. And that should have been kind of a red flag maybe, but not really. At first, they were super secretive about it, but then they realized kind of the environment they were in, and like they were basically looked at as like ghosts. And so eventually they just started they would just have these like huge pages of notes just on the table in the dining room and all just the common areas. No one ever batted an eye, at least not the staff. There was one instance that kind of like illustrated this. Basically, one of the patients, in his note-taking quest, he was approached by the nurse with his daily medication, and he looked up from this huge page of notes that was detailing all the comings and goings of the hospital, And she was like, here's your medication. And he was like, oh, what kind of medication is it? I need to like record this for my notes. And she just kind of like looked at him blankly and was like, oh, it's okay, honey. Like, you don't have to write it down. If you don't remember, you can just ask me, which is like, I feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like I'm there and I barely exist. You know, in the eyes of these nurses, I'm just like a fixture. It's very eerie. And all of these patients' files, they all mentioned the writing, of course, because, like, you know, they were doing it in the open, so everyone noticed. But all of the files, they would say things like, patient engages in writing behavior. Patient engages in writing behavior. Patient engages in writing behavior. Like, very clinical. And so basically they considered it to be like a compulsion that was part of their schizophrenic disorder. So even something as simple as just pacing around out of boredom was misconstrued as like a compulsion or a pathological behavior. One of the patient files said over and over again, nervous or compulsive pacing, or, you know, like patient engages in compulsive pacing. So one thing that began to kind of like materialize around these researchers is that basically the structure of the hospital, the hierarchy of the hospital, it was the most important aspect of the hospital. The patients basically, like, they weren't the reason the hospital existed. At that point, the hospitals had become like an environment of their own, a hierarchy of their own, and this basically trumped all needs, all, you know, inner lives, all complaints that the patients would have. There was a lot of abuse levied at the patients, the actual patients, but they were never believed because, you know, again, they're crazy, and also crazy in the eyes of the hospital. I'm not saying that. That's not my word. So yeah, any complaints or accusations of mistreatment by the staff to the patients was just brushed off because it's like, why am I going to believe you? We are this whole, you know, this entire scientific like hierarchy, this very credible government agency. So your word is basically nothing because, you know, you have schizophrenia. So why should I trust you? And they saw this again and again and again. So yes, their 2 months stay is getting extremely dark, extremely fast. Once a staff member, they saw a group of patients sitting outside the cafeteria like a half an hour before dinner time. And basically, instead of being like, well, they're probably bored because this eating is like one of the few actually enjoyable, pleasurable human activities that this place has to offer, so they're probably just excited to eat, they would basically look at excitement over food as this compulsive eating behavior or this like oral fixation. And that was mentioned in their notes a few times too. Basically, we can see the humanity is being eroded and just being replaced with, you know, you turn into a lab rat eventually. There's no thought of you being a normal person. There's no thought of you having an inner life, nothing. So this dull, this ambivalence, this kind of suffocating ambivalence began to kind of wear on the pseudo-patients a little bit. They kind of started to feel like they were invisible. They stopped even trying to hide that they were undercover, basically. One of the guys he walked up, there was a report at one point. This guy walked up and he was like, oh, I need to get some time off because I'm going to go. I made plans with my girlfriend to go to this drag racing event. And another guy, he asked his girlfriend to bring all of his psychology textbooks. The grad student was like, next time you visit, like, bring all my homework. I'm super behind. And she was like, no, remember, you can't do that. You're supposed to be undercover. And he was like, oh, right. I just forgot. Like, they became so dehumanized that they literally felt like they were invisible. They would be examined occasionally. They would have physicals, and the nurses and stuff, they would just do it like in full view of a bunch of people. And at first they were shy, but eventually they said, they just stopped caring because people just wouldn't even look at them. Like I said, like they were a piece of furniture or something. So the structure, a little bit about the structure or the daily comings and goings of these hospitals. Basically, it was said that the staff altogether, they spent a little over 11% of their day outside of this inner area. So let me back up for a second. The quarters, the living quarters or the employee areas that the staff had, there was this series of glass windows that kind of connected the hospital with the staff area. And there was this series of windows, and everyone called it the cage. So basically, 11% of the day for an average employee was spent outside of the cave. The rest of the time, they were like completely absent or just watching through the glass windows. They did that a lot. More than they came out, they would just sit there and observe you. So nurses would come out 11 times a day on average. Doctors and psychiatrists would come out even less, about 6 times a day. In the hospital, basically the hierarchy revolved around the cage. The most powerful would never emerge, the least powerful would emerge most often, and the powerless, the patients, were never allowed to enter the cage. It's like a castle with a moat, and you're just all the little peasants out there. So the patients, the pseudo-patients, they did interact with the staff often enough, but they were kind of careful not to approach the same nurse too often. But it's not like it really mattered that much, because here is an example of the way that these nurses would talk. So, for example, one person asked, "Hello, miss, could you tell me when I'm eligible for grounds?" "Hello, miss, could you tell me when I'm eligible for grounds privileges?" She responds, "Hello, how are you today?" and walks away without even looking at him, never stops walking, just completely ignoring the question. Yeah. Ooh, man, I'm getting mad. I hate when that happens. There was a lot of verbal abuses by the staff, and they didn't really worry. Like, if a staff member was basically berating someone, they didn't really have to worry because, like I said, they were pretty much protected by the institution. These pseudo-patients, they would see people basically invading the rooms at all times. There was like no privacy at all. Oftentimes, patients would be woken up in the morning by people just yelling and screaming at them first thing in the morning. Everybody had a super short temper in there. It was really, really short-staffed. A lot of these old-timey hospitals were really short-staffed. So I think that was part of the source of the short tempers, but at the same time, like that's not entirely it. There was a whole culture of dehumanization surrounding the patients. And this depersonalization was just really intense. Oh yeah, one more thing. One researcher, he tried to start romancing a nurse. He tried to strike up a whole relationship with her, and he told her all about the research. He blew his cover completely. He's like, yeah, I'm actually a researcher. This is a whole experiment. You wouldn't believe what I'm up to. And of course, she just brushed him off because, he's schizophrenic, or at least schizophrenic in remission. Yes. He would also try to practice. He basically became a therapist for the actual patients there. So he became this member of the staff, kind of, in a way, although I imagine he was a lot more compassionate towards them. But basically it's just anything I don't care about my mission anymore, anything to feel like a normal person again, anything to regain my life that I had on the outside. And remember, this whole time, they don't even know if they're gonna be able to get out. For all they know, they're stuck in there forever. So you can only imagine. So, finally, they were all released, not at the same time, but, they all got out. In the end, they got out, much to their relief. It probably caused some psychological damage. I can't imagine they'd be better coming out than they were going in. But we can conclude a couple things. This, like I said 1,000 times, I reported this, or I re-said this a lot, but the whole point of this paper is that psychological diagnoses they're hard to overcome, nearly impossible, and they put you into a box. Also, the system of mental hospitals, it doesn't exist, at least back in the day. It didn't exist to help the patients. There's no therapeutic value at all. It's basically like, just put them in here, let them rot, we'll give them Thorazine or whatever else. So this whole thing actually caused like a lot of good in the world. It was published and it became a pretty famous paper, and it's famous to this day, and it helped a lot, like shed light on what was going on behind these closed doors. Also, there's some pop culture things inspired by this. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is partially inspired by this. It's a combination of that and the MK Ultra experiments, actually. The Rosenhan Experiment, it actually is a very culturally important... Blah, blah. My tongue is getting clumsy here. I can't talk. It's culturally important, is what I'm saying. So this is all, we can imagine this is all completely wrapped up, right? This is all on the level. This entirely, every detail is exactly as I stated. Well, actually, unfortunately, no. There is a lot of there's a lot of questions being asked about this Rosenhan guy, and in the book, there's a book called The Great Pretender, and it's about how this guy may have made significant amounts of this completely up. The only person they were ever actually able to contact out of these like pseudo patients, as he called them, was the 20-year-old grad student, and he was then a professor at the University of Minneapolis. I think he still teaches there, actually. Is a guy named, oh man, what was his name? Never mind, it doesn't really matter. But basically somebody tracked him down and asked him about it, and he was like, I actually had a great time in there. He said he felt a lot better coming out of it. He formed these deep bonds with the other patients there. He said he got really into writing folk music, and he was like, yeah, I was totally fine. Like this whole experiment, like at least for me, it was fine. So he either left all of that out or twisted the story a lot, which if you're going to do an actual experiment, you have to leave that in. So that's a huge problem with this experiment. Also, a lot of the hospitals, they have really, generally speaking, mental hospitals, they have, from back in the day, they have a bit of a record-keeping issue, or at least they can. However, with that being said, you'd think there would be more evidence that any of these pseudo-patients actually existed, but no one could really find any evidence. So for all we know, it actually could have just been Rosenhan and his friend, the grad student that did this, in which case, like half of the experiment was completely opposite to what he said. Also, they tracked down the person who had interviewed Rosenhan himself to do his admission interview to the hospital. And they were like, so according to this paper, you let him in really easily. All he had to say was quickly like, yeah, I'm hearing voices. And according to the records, they were like, no, he was going on and on and on about how these voices never stop. They're so loud. I'm super suicidal. And he was like, he said he was wearing a pot on his head. Not at the time, but he would often put a pot on his head to try to like block the voices out. So he left that out. And yeah, clearly it was a lot trickier to actually get into these places than you might think. And this makes me think that maybe the 20-something-year-old grad student, he may have actually needed to be in there if it helped him so much. I don't know. This whole thing is extremely weird and murky. And I don't really know what to think of this Rosenhan guy. Also, he was a professor, and he basically, obviously, he disproved all of this, or he dismissed all this. But one of his students was like, one time he sat on my lap. He gave a whole lecture sitting on my lap for the whole lecture, which is super strange. But other than that, his students generally liked him. They said, yeah, he was a super weird guy, but he was really charismatic. And they said A lot of the female students were like, I don't know, he's kind of like ugly and he has this massive like balding head, but they said there was some kind of, you know, unique sensuality about this guy. So this experiment, whether it was completely made up or not, I feel like, I don't know, I'm kind of divided on this. I think there is truth to this experiment. I think there's a core truth of, yes, mental illness, people with mental illness are treated very unfairly. And at the time, there's mountains of evidence to suggest that people were being mistreated. The whole lobotomies thing, shock therapy, all of this stuff. People like even Charles Manson, he went to a similar institution when he was a kid, and his stories are just unreal. And yeah, whatever. You can be like, why would you trust Charles Manson? You know, he might be crazy, he might be a tiny little maniac, but I do think he was honest about his past. So this paper, it did a lot of good, even though it's a little murky. The evidence may have been manufactured a little bit. And yeah, that is the story of the Rosenhan experiment, perpetrated by David Rosenhan and maybe 8 other people, maybe 1 other person. So, yes, indeed. All right. I'll be right back. We can talk about Western State Hospital in Lakewood, Washington. We can talk about its dark history, some pretty modern historical things with it as well. And yeah, we can dive into its most famous patient there, Francis Farmer. So I'll be right back. You're listening to Family Recipe Radio here on 94.9 KZAX Bellingham. I will return shortly. Don't go anywhere. We're back, and now we're going to get into the Western State Hospital, which is located pretty close by in Lakewood, Washington. So, what is this place? Besides a nightmare world where people were shocked and lobotomized and dunked in ice buckets for some reason. So, this place, it was originally named the Fort Steilacoom Asylum. It was founded in 1871. It's the second oldest mental hospital in Washington, and it's basically been horrible forever. So initially, it was just horribly overpopulated, full of rats, full of just disease. Everything was just disgusting. Eventually, it was knocked down and rebuilt when Washington actually became a state instead of just a fort. So there's that. They did kind of improve it a little bit, and a lot of the same structures that were built are still there. It's kind of the same setup anyway, at least. So, yes. What about recent years? We don't have to go back over 100 years to talk about the horrors of the hospital. There were some pretty wild things that happened. For example, in 2016, 2 patients escaped. It was a pretty high-profile escape, actually, and one of them was a man named Anthony Carver. He was convicted of a murder in which he stabbed a woman dozens of times in Lake Stevens, Washington. In 2006, Garver was arrested in Spokane after his mother called the police for threatening her life. Real friendly guy, and threatening the lives of their neighbors. So he was discovered in the woods nearby with hundreds of rounds of ammunition, something he was forbidden to have because of his previous convictions and mental issues. So 2 days before his sentencing in 2007, a whole bunch of bizarre writings were discovered in his jail cell detailing his plans for several bank robberies, carjackings, just straight up armed robberies. There was a plan for him he was planning to plant a bomb in a government building in order to kill the prosecutor that was on his case. And his cellie said that Garver had a fixation on ISIS, the ISIS that we all know and love. He was attempting to learn Arabic in the lead up to his terrorism plot. So, yeah, this guy, he's got some issues, to say the least. He was released in 2009, but immediately violated the terms of his supervised release by stealing a vehicle and, again, hiding in the woods. He seems to love hiding in the woods. He drove to Montana, and this resulted in a high-speed chase with the police, and he was jailed again. And he got out in 2011, and then he started befriending this woman, Felipa Evans Lopez. She was 20 years old, and he would one day go on to murder this poor soul. She was said to be very troubled. She had a pretty bad drug addiction. And I'm not going to go into the details of the actual murder because I think I probably would get booted off the air. But suffice to say, it was pretty bad. So during his whole sentencing, this guy is just a straight up demon. I can't even... Anyway, during his sentencing, he was deemed unfit to stand trial, so he was sent to Western State Hospital for psychiatric treatment. And he began, after a couple of years, he began slowly loosening a window in his room over 5 months, every day, just a little bit more every single night. And one night in 2016, he jumped out with another guy, Mark Alexander Adams, who was 59. I couldn't find a whole lot on Mark Alexander Adams, besides the fact that he was in there for a domestic violence charge. So we can imagine this guy. He's not the greatest, maybe not a budding domestic terrorist, but not good either. So that guy was pretty much caught immediately, and then eventually Garver was arrested again. And where do you think he was at? Where do you think he was arrested? He's hiding in the woods by his mother's house, the same place he was found initially with all the ammunition. So, in 2018, the hospital also came under a lot of fire for a long history of mistreatment of the staff there. Apparently, they're extremely overworked, and there was a whole series of assaults on the nurses. A lot of them are pretty old, too. There was a 63-year-old woman who was... she had her head stomped by some guy in the TV room. Another case... a nurse was tackled and a portion of her ear was bitten off by a patient. And in both cases, they kind of mixed them around the hospital. It's a really big hospital. It can hold, I think, max capacity can hold 1,000 people, but I think it's supposed to hold 800. So basically what they would do, they would just transfer the violent patients away from the nurses that they had attacked already. I don't know how that would help. I guess they were they can't come finish you off, so whatever. You're happy, aren't you, huh? You feel safe in here in Western State Hospital. Yeah. So eventually the hospital was forced to pay, I think all in all, $2 million to some of its employees who had been attacked. So I guess that's a win for the employees there. But before all of this, we need to go back in time. That's the time travel sound. Ding dong, ding dong. Clock noises. Okay. The very early days of the asylum, like I said, rat infested, rampant with disease. People were basically just put there to die. So a very insidious aspect of the early days of Western State Hospital was that, or then Fort Steilacoom, was that people would be, a lot of the time they'd be put in by their family members, and their policy, or the policy of hospitals at the time, was that all of their assets would be forfeited to a state-appointed guardian or a court-appointed guardian. And there's a few cases of people's family members, usually a step or a sister-in-law or something, or a brother-in-law or whatever, committing their family members in order to steal their house and stuff. There was this woman named Alice Vinzot. She was completely sane. She was brought in by a relative, and they immediately were just yep, she should be in here. She was jailed for several years until the early 1900s. So They were especially cruel to her, I think, or maybe it was just like this for everyone, but I think it did reference the fact they were extra mean to her. So she was kept in complete isolation. She was never allowed to go out into the grounds. She was denied any contact with the outside world, no writing. She couldn't read. She couldn't exercise. And so what she did, she would write letters and just plead for help, and she would drop them out her window. Maybe she also slowly loosened it like Anthony Garver. And it also, in this case, led to her escape because one day, one of those letters she had been dropping for years was discovered by somebody. And she basically was released as a result of that. But she had no money, no house, no possessions because her family had stolen it all. So that's nice, right? You love hearing about this on a Friday night. This is really cheery, ain't it? So, during the 1940s, the hospital became really, really overcrowded. So it was designed to hold 2,000 patients, but at the time it was designed to hold 2,000 patients, but it had ended up, the total population went up to 3,000 with only 12 nurses and 40 doctors. That is ridiculous. Even today, the hospital is pretty overcrowded, but nowhere nearly as bad as it was. 1,000 too many people. That is just, oh man, that's disgusting. I can't imagine. It's probably so like dirty in there too, man. Poor people. See, this is what I'm saying. Mental institutions, they're just so evil, or at least at this time. So here's what we were waiting for: lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and another treatment that involved dunking patients into ice water. It was used a lot. And back then, shock therapy was they're trying to jumpstart your brain or something. They're trying to, oh man, it's just so much electricity. And yeah, I can't imagine it ever did any good. And we're not really going to get into lobotomies because that's a whole like other topic. But suffice to say, all of these things, all of these bizarre early treatments for psychiatric disorders were in full swing at this hospital. And I believe it was used as like a prototype, one of the prototype hospitals for this kind of stuff, because there's so many people there. And I believe it was one of the horrible places that kind of experimented on people who were helpless and forgotten by society. Isn't that nice? So, all of this brings us to the most well-known Western State Hospital victim, let's say, not a patient, a victim. Her name was Frances Farmer. So, Frances Farmer, there's a lot to be said about her. She's had a very action-packed life, to be honest. There's some books on her. I believe there's a movie on her. And there is some, I guess, questions to be asked about her history, and she is kind of shrouded in mystery just a little bit, in my opinion. There's a bit of a haze around her. However, we're just going to go by do a quick summary of her life. So she was born in 1913 on September 19th in Seattle, Washington. Yeah, hometown girl, almost hometown girl. So her parents separated, and she was left to be raised by her mother, who was said to be extremely domineering. They never really got along, and this relationship would get way worse later in life. So she had a childhood of increasing instability, and she was shuttled back and forth a lot between Chico, California, and Seattle. And this all gave her quite a bit of frustration that would never really leave. She had a lot of angst throughout her life, except for at the end. She found a little bit of peace at the end, so we can look forward to that. I'm just warning you, not all of this is going to be completely grim, but yes, she had found that she felt really angsty about the world. She was struggling with her belief system, this being the 1920s and 30s at this point. This is a very oppressive time period, and she has a very modern outlook on the world. So she wrote this essay at age 16 that she won a writing competition for. She called it God Dies, which, as you can imagine, it sparked a lot of controversy, and considering it was 1929. But it wasn't like an annoying atheist screed. It wasn't super condescending. It was more of her personal meditation on her own kind of frustrations and her own tumultuous life. It was more of a, what, I haven't seen any evidence of God kind of thing. I'm doing a bad job explaining it, but it wasn't full atheist. She never was an atheist. She said that she was an agnostic at first, and then she became a Catholic in the end. But she was extremely misrepresented by the media at the time. They were super mad at her. So this is the first instance of major misunderstandings being thrown at her. She spent her life basically trying to break free of these situations that were put around her, that some of them were out of her control. Some of them later on were self-inflicted. But to me, the theme of Frances Farmer's life was someone who was who felt confined and kept having the culture around her, the mechanisms of society around her were just saying like, no, you belong here, you belong in here and here and here. And it eventually culminated in her being literally jammed into a mental institution. So yeah, I don't know if it's fascinating how these themes in people's lives show up. What can we do about it? I don't know. We just have to be along for the ride, I guess. So she attended the University of Washington. She became involved in the theater department. And during her last year of school, she won a trip to the Soviet Union. Yes. It was basically a subscription competition for the leftist magazine, The Voice of Action. So I think it's like, oh, if you sell enough of copies or if you get people to buy enough subscriptions, we'll send you to the Soviet Union. Which again, obviously stirred up a lot of local controversy because she is also a communist as well as an atheist. Oh no. So her mother was like, please don't go to the Soviet Union. This is going to be bad for everyone. Your reputation's going to be affected by this. And also she was probably like not a fan of communism either. Most people weren't. But the real reason she wanted to go is she wanted to just check out the art scene in Moscow. And so she went and she accepted the trip. She checked out the theater scene, the art scene there. And the same year, she graduated with a bachelor's in drama. So now the year is 1935. She's done with college. She is back in the U.S. So she's an actress. Where does she go? She goes to New York City. So she gets an apartment with her friend. She meets this guy, Oscar Serlin, who a talent scout for Paramount Pictures. So she signed a 7-year contract with Paramount. Then she moved to Hollywood, baby. Yes, 1930s Hollywood. Right in there with the Black Dahlia murders probably were happening around then too, right? I think it was like 1935 or something. Anyway, so she was featured in a lot of movies. One of them I remember because it had such an odd title. It was called Too Many Parents. And she was in a couple of Westerns, but she usually was kind of the typical starlet, as they were called, just kind of the generic, beautiful Hollywood love interest in these movies. So she did a whole lot of those. She saw the inner workings of Hollywood, but despite her success, she was a very intelligent person. She was opinionated, I guess. She had her own cosmology. So she started getting really disillusioned and tired of these rules. She wanted something that kind of reflected her own, she didn't feel like these rules were real. She couldn't relate to them, and that would drive anyone nuts. I can't imagine, we all kind of get sick of our jobs, but imagine if your job is literally pretending to be somebody you're not. That would drive you nuts, at least me. I don't know though. I've never really worked like a direct customer service job, so I guess that's kind of what customer service is. You have to be a 1930s Hollywood starlet, no matter what your mood is. So anyway, she's starting to get disillusioned. She wants something real, something darker, something more gritty, but it was not to be. It was not to be. These producers and stuff were like, no, I basically own you now because this is how Hollywood works. It's very, there's a lot of, power imbalances in the system, even today, but not, back then it was just awful. So I'm breezing over a lot of this because her time in Hollywood is really complicated. It's a lot of personal drama and a lot of producers doing shady stuff. But suffice to say, she got married, she had an affair, her husband had an affair. Basically, that ended. She saw Hollywood as being a very dark, deceitful place. So she, she was married to Leif Erikson, by the way. I forgot to mention that. That's who she was married to. So basically, yeah, she started acting out. She started basically standing up for herself, and Paramount suspended her because she didn't take the role, the love interest role in a film called Take the Letter, Darling. Take the Letter, Darling. You can hear like the music in the background. It's really dramatic string section. All right, so somewhere along the way, it's Hollywood, baby. She picked up a drinking problem. So 1942, she's been dismissed from Paramount Pictures. She kind of starts getting into some legal issues, you know how it goes. So, 1942. It was World War II. There was a regional blackout in that region of California. But she was pulled over in the middle of the night, driving just full high beams on, not a care in the world. There's no blackout here. No. If there was a blackout, why am I able to turn my lights on, huh? So, she was pulled over, and she didn't have her driver's license or was refusing to hand it over, and she yelled at the officers, apparently, and she was jailed overnight on account of being drunk. I don't even think she got a DUI. They were just like, yeah, you're drunk. I'm going to put you in the drunk tank. So she was released the next day. She had this fine to pay. It was $500. She paid $250, and she left. And she hid away in her Santa Monica home for the time being. So, in November of the same year, she was returning from Mexico City from a movie production that ended up being a complete bust, and the whole thing had to be abandoned. And it was an adaptation of a John Steinbeck book. I can't remember which one, but basically she got there like as the whole thing came crashing down, and they were like, yeah, this isn't working out. We have to abandon ship. So she turned right around. So she came back to her house, and she found out like all of her possessions were just gone. She came back home, and a whole different family was in her house. And she was like, what is going on? So her sister and her mom had like cleared all her stuff out. So they rented her a room in the Knickerbocker Hotel in the meantime. Tricky word that is. So in January of 1943, she was living in the Knickerbocker Hotel, extended stay. She still hadn't paid the rest of that fine, that extra $250 she needed to pay. So she was a bench warrant was issued for her, and basically at the same moment, like not literally, but like the same week or the same couple of days, she was getting all done up. Her makeup was getting done up on the studio makeup artist, or the hair artist in this case, was getting her ready for a shoot, and something happened. She punched this hairdresser, dislocated her jaw, and so the police came to scoop her up at the hotel later that night. They drag her out of there. So the following morning, they took her to court, and she had kind of a bit of a breakdown. She threw an inkwell at the judge, which I think is kind of fun. If you have an opportunity to do that, maybe do. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not actually Don't follow that advice. I just think it's funny. An inkwell. So she threw an inkwell at a judge. So they asked her about her drinking, and she said, "I put liquor in my milk, in my coffee, and in my orange juice." She also said she was regularly taking Benzedrine, which is one of those early amphetamines. People, so many amphetamines back in the day. You could just go to like the dentist, and you'd be like, you could go to the dentist to make an appointment for your cleaning, and they'd be like, "You want some Benzedrine?" Like, you don't even have to get any medical treatment. Like, they were just handing these things out like candy. So she was on basically super powerful Adderall and drinking a lot. So she was sentenced to 180 days of jail. On the way out, she knocked down 2 police officers. She made a wild leap for the phone, but was eventually subdued and carried away. And as she was dragged out of the courtroom, she was heard to yell, "Haven't you ever had a broken heart?" So she ended up being transferred to Los Angeles General Hospital instead of jail. She was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis, which is pretty scary sounding, and was then transferred again to Kimball Sanitarium. So this is where the mental health treatments began for her. For the first time in her life, she was subjected to the mental illness system in America at the time. So basically what they did, she underwent insulin shock therapy, which is basically a huge injection of insulin into an otherwise healthy person in order to subdue them, because it basically puts you into like a coma state, depending on the dose. Usually you are totally unconscious, and sometimes they just give you a little bit and you just get really lethargic and unable to resist or freak out or anything. But she was given insulin shock therapy and was basically in a semi-conscious state for 90 days straight, which is just insane. So after 9 months, Farmer, she was discharged, and eventually she was reunited with her mother, Lillian, which was an absolutely horrible move for both of them. So they moved back to Seattle, and they fought constantly, and eventually Frances attacked her. And this is when she was sent to Western State Hospital. You can hear the lightning crash and everything. So, yes, evil Western State Hospital. So, Frances, in a 1958 interview, she said this about her first time, or the beginning part of her incarceration at this hospital. I was much like everybody. I was much like anyone else that's admitted to a public institution. They don't have the means for individual psychiatric care. There's only so many beds available. I stood in line with 15 or 20 girls like myself in the hospital for one reason or another. We received shots or hydrotherapy or electric shock treatment. This was supposed to relax the tension and keep us quiet, which it did. I don't blame the hospital at all. I think they did everything in their power to take care of the enormous number of people they had, but it didn't really help me much. After 3 months, she was released, but immediately was arrested for vagrancy, which that's like an old-timey crime. Vagrancy, basically just wandering with no place to go. That was in Antioch, California. So in January of 1945, her father took her to her aunt's ranch in Yarrington, Nevada, but she escaped. She escaped and went to a movie theater in Reno, where she was apprehended by police and sent back to Western State Hospital in a higher security wing for violent patients, quote unquote. She remained there for the following 9 years. So Frances Farmer's autobiography, Will There Really Be a Morning? It was published after her death in 1970, and it went through her entire saga at Western State Hospital, and it was completely brutal. The accounts in her books, there is some speculations about how valid these details are, but considering how much we know about other institutions, I would not be surprised if there is more than a kernel of truth to this. I imagine that it was really, really bad. She was subject to constant electroshock therapy. Her room was infested with rats. There was constant sexual assault by the orderlies. She was locked in a straitjacket for days, nearly drowned in ice baths. Yes, all horrible, horrible abuses. Now, whether or not it's actually sensationalized, I don't know. Some people claim it was ghostwritten by her friend, but I mean, I can promise you there is a lot of truth to, I mean, I can't promise you, but in my mind, I can promise you there is some truth to that. Yes, her being, you know, she was in her early 30s, very beautiful, small woman. Yeah, there was going to be some horrible stuff going on. Anyway, sorry. Dark stuff. So, after years of legal trouble and medical torture, basically, Frances Farmer, she was finally released in 1950, and finally for her, life calmed down a little bit more. Whew. She deserves some peace and quiet. So she did have a drunk driving crash, but that was fine. Apparently when she got arrested, she decided to like turn into one of her old characters from one of the movies she was playing. And I wish I had written this down, but I can't remember what she said. She basically had to play this really rich aristocratic woman, and she got arrested. And as they were like dragging her out of the wreckage, she was like, I run this town. Like, I'll buy all of you off. I'm the king. And she was like, yeah, it didn't really work. I don't know. People didn't like my performance. So yeah, she crashed her car in somewhere between 1950 and 60. So she attempted an acting comeback, but it didn't really work as far as TV and movies and stuff goes. She had a couple of short-lived marriages, but ultimately, the end of her life, she became a resident actress at Purdue University. So she did some stage acting, and she spent the rest of her days basically acting. Her free time was spent writing poetry and painting, and eventually she converted to Catholicism. She gave up drinking at long last, and began writing her autobiography, which she didn't finish herself, actually. This is where the speculation comes that somebody came in there and sensationalized it. I mean, I hope somebody did. The alternative is just horrible torture, so I'm praying to God that somebody made all of this up. So, yes, her friend published the book a year after she died. So, in 1970, she died of cancer due to a lifelong pack-a-day smoking habit. So I really hope, Frances Farmer, if you're out there, I hope you found some peace in the last days of your life. And I gotta watch some of your movies sometime. Maybe they're really good. I'm not a huge 1930s movie person, but I also haven't seen that many of them, so maybe I'm missing out. Maybe get some film noir going here. So, that is the story of the chaotic, turbulent life of Frances Farmer and the horrors of the Western State Hospital here in Washington State. So that is my tale for the day. I hope you guys enjoyed. If anyone's out there, is anyone out there? So yes, thank you for listening. This is Family Recipe Radio here on 94.9 KZAX. And now, I'm going to play some music. I have until 9 o'clock, so it's time to chill out and listen to music. So I'll see you guys. I'll talk to you guys later. Goodbye now.